Oh, great. So now we have our attendees here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone. I'm Kathryn Zavala. Welcome to MedTech Innovator Live. This is our webinar series where we bring in panelists to discuss topics related to or relevant to the medical technology startups. Today's topic, we're going to cover intellectual property strategy. And so we're joined by 3 panelists today, and I'll give each of them an opportunity to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Doug Limbach.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I am Doug Limbach. I'm a partner with Shay. We're an IP firm located in San Mateo, California. We've been established for 12 years. There's 12 of us IP practitioners. We specialize in representing early stage medical device companies.
Great, thank you. And then we have Yuri Greenwald.
Hi, so I'm a patent attorney at Wilson Sonsini. My background is medicine. I have a medical degree, and I actually went through almost an entire general surgery training program before changing gears and going to law school. At Wilson Sonsini, I love to work with medical device startup companies, but have experience in the software space and in the pharma space as well.
Great, thank you, Yuri. And then last we have Doug Portnow.
Thank you, Kathryn. Morning, everybody. I'm a partner at Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, and my practice focuses primarily on medical device patent prosecution. That's literally everything from head to toe, from deep brain stimulation, cardiology, orthopedics, et cetera, and glad to be here.
Great, thank you all for joining us today. This is our very first webinar in the series this year, so very exciting for us. We're going to go ahead and kick off with our first question. So this was actually one that was submitted by one of our companies, and will be something we talk about a little bit more throughout the broadcast, but I thought we could just start with a little brief answer to this question. So what is the best strategy with regards to building an IP profile for or portfolio for early stage companies? And how does this strategy influence the company's attractiveness to potential acquirers? So Doug L., we'll start with you.
Okay. Strategy for early stage startups usually is quite different than for larger medical device companies with deeper pockets. The story for larger companies usually is it's all about quantity, not so much quality. You've got lots of patents that are incremental in value, but for an early stage company, it really is a smaller number of patents and more strategic. You really want to have strong patents to start building the foundation for your portfolio. And it often is a chicken and egg type problem for early stage companies. You need funding oftentimes to get your patents started, and you need patents to get your funding. So the strategy typically involves starting off slow with a provisional or two and until you get more funding, and then building your portfolio as you go. Freedom to operate is the same situation. You'd love to do all kinds of prior art searching right out of the gate, but typically you don't want to burn your resources immediately. You want to keep your powder dry until you've got more funding and more established product developed. So that's kind of a basic strategy for early stage medical device companies.
That's great. Yuri, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so just from the perspective of representing potential investors and looking for the investors at IP that held by startup companies, a lot of investors use the term blocking patents. They want to see that company is thinking about how to keep competitors away from their commercial product. And so that it's important as you develop the portfolio, really be thinking about what is the essence of your technology, what makes you special, and making sure that your claims capture that. That's something that I know investors want to see and adds a lot of value.
Great. And Doug P.
I totally agree with the other guys. I think I would just add that again, in the early phase, there's a lot of innovation going on rather than in the later stages where it may be just incremental improvements. So during those early phases where you're innovating, you want to capture a lot of that in applications. And a good mechanism for doing that is by using provisional patent applications. There are lower filing fees. Oftentimes you can get away with a little bit less disclosure in those, so the patent application itself may be a little bit less expensive. Of course, the caveat being that your patent application is only as good as the amount of disclosure in it. But provisionals are good mechanisms, and that gives you 1 year to sort of decide whether that invention is worth pursuing or not. And then at the 1 year, you can either convert the application into a regular utility application or PCT, or you can just let it die.
Perfect. So we'll jump right into talking a little bit more about protecting IP and how to protect it. You mentioned that there's a lot of innovation that's happening with these early stage startups. And so they're all working in these very small teams. Maybe Doug P, you could talk a little bit. What are some good practices for IP generation within these small teams?
Capture your ideas, record your invention, record your thoughts, your inventions on invention disclosures, and have a team, an interdisciplinary team within the company that would be like an R&D person, maybe a marketing person, maybe a patent person that can review and evaluate the commercial value of those inventions, and you can decide whether you want to spend the money and pursue those inventions in patent applications. So I think that would probably be my first idea.
Great, and you also talked a little bit about capturing your innovations, and that actually leads into the next question. When companies are looking to provide to file their provisionals or their full patents, is it better to capture all the inventions in one patent or to separate them into different patents? So Yuri, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so the patent law requires that each invention, so each single invention, be captured in one single patent. So what that means is when a patent issues with a set of claims, those claims have to all be directed to a single invention. There could be slight different variations in that invention, but it's a general principle that it's one patent per invention. Now you can describe as many inventions in a single disclosure patent application as you want, but you will have to break it up into multiple different patents ultimately, because as I said, per the law, each set of claims has to correspond to one single invention. It can be tempting to take this approach just because there might appear to be an efficiency argument for just kind of throwing everything together in a single application in a single sitting with a patent attorney, just to basically have them crank it out. But I've found that there can be some practical drawbacks in doing that and putting everything together in a single application. Certainly one of the practical drawbacks is you can end up with a situation where just each innovation doesn't get as much time as it really deserves. And so I always recommend that if inventors come to me and they have what clearly looks like multiple distinct separable inventions, I'll encourage them to file a separate patent application for each invention.
Great, and Doug L, anything you want to add to that?
I would not add much to that other than to say, yeah, each case is unique, and you strike the right balance between piling everything into one application and splitting it out into multiple applications. Sometimes, as Yuri said, you can save money filing fees by putting them together. An advantage to keeping them separate and trying to separate it into as many applications as possible, as it tends to make your portfolio look bigger for investors. They realize that there's not just one application, but you really have a lot of innovations going on, and they can see all the different applications you have on file.
Right, and I think this kind of leads in to something more related to our MedTech companies. So a lot of them have software and and hardware components. And so, you mentioned separating things out, but in certain cases, does it make sense to combine hardware and software into one patent? How about Doug L? We'll continue with you.
I'm sorry, was that me?
Doug L.
Okay. Again, it's case specific, but oftentimes it does make sense to separate the software from the hardware, specifically if they're doing different functions. There are two different types of claims with their own set of challenges. But depending on the circumstances, if the same thing can be done with software and with hardware, in that case, you probably would combine them into a single application and wait to see if the patent office then gives you a restriction requirement, forcing you to divide them up into two separate applications.
Sure. And Doug P, following up about the software, when filing software patents, is it necessary to submit code?
No, not really. Again, what you have to do in your patent application is disclose enough information so that a mythical person of skill in the art can read the patent application, understand the invention, and then be able to practice that or do that invention. So a lot of times actually listing code is not necessary.
Right, and before we leave, the topic of software, there's other strategies for protecting IP. One of them being a trade secret. So, Doug P, continuing with you, do you have any advice for when to keep code or anything as a trade secret and when to file a patent?
It's definitely a balancing act between patenting something where your invention is going to eventually publish and become publicly disclosed to the world, versus keeping something trade secret where nobody will know about it. So that balance is, again, with a patent, you have roughly a 20-year life of protection and eventual publication of that to the world. Whereas trade secret, you can protect your invention for as long as you can keep it secret. Some classic examples are the recipe for Kentucky Fried Chicken or the formula for Coca-Cola. Those have been enormously successful trade secrets that have been, well managed and very carefully guarded. And so those have gone on for many, many years. So you have to sort of balance the two. The other thing to consider is keeping a trade secret on something that can easily be reverse engineered may not be a good idea, because once the product or the service or whatever is out on the market, if someone can just buy it or get a copy of it and rip it apart and figure it out and reverse engineer it, then it's no longer a trade secret. Whereas if you have the patent, you still have protection. So those are kind of the things to think about. And also trade secrets are harder to enforce because you don't know what people are doing in their manufacturing facility. So you kind of have to balance all of those out.
Right. And Yuri, anything that you'd like to add about that?
Yeah, just in terms of software, but I guess in terms of all inventions. So just something to keep in mind is if you keep something a trade secret, you can't prevent someone from developing it independently. So if you invent A and you keep it a trade secret, somebody else independently invents A, well, they can take A to the market and compete with you. Whereas if you were able to claim A in an issued patent, you could assert that patent against them and keep them off the market. So again, that's something to weigh when making this decision.
And also in regards to trade secret, a lot of our companies are conducting clinical trials and have amassed a lot of clinical data. So, what to do with that data? Is that something that's, considered a trade secret? Is it something that you can license? And, what's your advice with that? Yuri, will continue with you.
Yeah, so I definitely, it's situation dependent. So data can be used in the IP space. Data is also very valuable in the regulatory space. When using data in the regulatory space, it can be difficult or even not really possible to keep it secret, if it's part of your regulatory approval process. in the IP space, again, it's very situation specific. If you're using data to reduce your invention to practice, it is something that you might want to consider, keeping out of your patent applications and keeping out of the public domain, so that you don't give away all of the development that you did and spent money and resources doing, so that a competitor can get a head start. So it definitely can be something that you want to keep a secret. And as such, I think in that intellectual property space, it could also be something that you could potentially monetize. I do think that. I have not personally encountered that, but I think that if you had the right kind of data and it could help someone else get a head start on a product development, it could be very valuable.
Great, thank you all. And so, before we leave the subject of, IP and how to protect it, one more question. A lot of our companies are part of, they have public disclosures, so either doing a presentation or participating in some of the MedTech Innovator pitch events. And so one of the questions is, what constitutes public disclosure and how do you handle potential disclosures and presentations? So Doug L., we'll start with you.
So public disclosure it's not always a black and white line, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So what's public disclosure in the US is different than what's public disclosure, for instance, in Europe. And so there are cases where you can give a disclosure to a small group of people in a public presentation, and it's not considered public disclosure. But, to be conservative and to not end up being the company that's that test case that shows, oh, that's not something you want to do. You want to take the high road, and if you even think it's close to being public disclosure, you want to make sure you've got something on file before you disclose it, because once you publicly disclose something, you just waived your foreign filing rights, and you started a 1-year clock ticking in the US for when you need to file a patent application. So the best way to keep things from being publicly disclosed is make sure you've got an NDA in place, a non-disclosure agreement with investors and partners and anybody you want to disclose confidential information to. That way you can prove that you had control of the inventive information and you weren't just letting it out into the public.
Right. Okay, so then let's move on to talking a little bit about where to protect. So, how do companies think about which geographies they should be protecting their IP in? Many of them start with the U.S., but is that the best strategy? So, Doug P., we'll start with you.
I think you have to sort of look at markets, and obviously the two big medical device markets are the U.S. and Europe. So those are kind of on the must-do list, I would say. Then there are other countries that are potentially big markets. Japan is a big market. China also is a huge market. But again, the question of how enforceable are IP rights in China always is looming over the horizon. India is another big market, again, with the question of enforceability of IP in India. Canada is a small market, but it has a sophisticated medical device market. Australia is another market. So those are kind of some of the major jurisdictions that medical device patents are often filed in. Also, things to think about is if you have a strategic corporate partner, they may have a specific interest in a particular jurisdiction. I had a startup client that has a partnership with a large corporation, and that large corporation was very interested in Brazil. We never would have recommended filing in Brazil had it not been for the input of that large corporation. We have some clients that are very interested in Israel. Israel is a very small market. I think roughly there's a population of 5 million people in Israel, something like that. But again, they felt like there was a reason to protect the invention in there, not so much from a seller point of view, but really just to prevent people from manufacturing their invention in Israel and then exporting it to other jurisdictions. Those are kind of, the major ones. And also if you have an investor or a very influential board member, sometimes they have some bias or favoritism to filing in, their home countries. Those are things to think about.
Great. And digging a little deeper into that, you guys have had, many clients throughout the years, and have you, what kind of mistakes have you seen companies make when filing internationally, and how can our companies avoid that? Doug L., maybe we could start with you.
The mistakes, I would say, I've not seen any huge mistakes, but some companies tend to spend a lot of money on foreign filing, and then they realize that they've burned through their budget and they can't keep it up, and they have to start abandoning things they've started. So I would say kind of look at the budgeting long term, and if you're not committed to spending the sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars it takes to keep patent applications alive in numerous foreign countries, maybe not spend the money at all. An inexpensive way to keep your options open for the first 30 months is to file a patent cooperation treaty, a PCT application. And that allows you to postpone these decisions until 30 months, and then you decide which countries you want to go into outside the US, if any. But you need to keep in mind, once you do enter these countries, that unlike the US, a lot of these countries have annuities, fees you have to pay every year that go up every year, even before your patent issues. So it can get expensive if you try to get coverage across the globe. So just I think budget-wise, most startups will focus on the U.S. and Europe, and then maybe Japan after that. I agree with all the countries that Doug P. Identified. Long-term, you want to think what your potential acquirer or partners, what markets they want to go into. But typically starting with the U.S. and Europe is a sound strategy. Or another approach is to, on your core inventions, maybe your first application, you go broader than that and file in as many countries as you can. But then with subsequent applications, maybe you just file in US and Europe, and then it's the incremental improvements get smaller. Maybe you just file in the US, so you're saving your IP budget that way.
That's great advice. Okay, so let's move into a discussion about dealing with third parties. And for a lot of these, the initial third party would be universities. So a lot of inventions come out of a university, and now companies have spun out of a university, and now they're trying to license the IP. So let's talk about strategy with dealing with a university tech transfer office. Can you guys provide any advice on negotiating with the TTO and the licensing of IP? Yuri, let's start with you.
Yeah, so my thinking on this may differ from others, but I think, and I don't mean to be funny in saying this, but I think that the first step, if you're the inventor and you're affiliated with the university and it's your spin out company, you have to kind of be at peace and accept that the university owns the IP, and that's how the law works. And so any negotiation is going to be with them really holding the leverage because they own the IP. So that's kind of the starting point. And with that acceptance, I typically recommend that as much as is possible, that the negotiations be friendly. So as an approach, I think I see the university licensing as a partnership that certainly is in a lot of ways frustrating and has disadvantages, but offers advantages as well. Actually quite a few advantages, and having that friendly relationship will not only likely lead to a license agreement that's probably more flexible or more fair, but also leverage all of the positives that the university has to offer in the long term for you.
Good. Doug P., anything to add?
Couple thoughts. Definitely agree with Yuri that universities are in this game. They could because they want to make money, so they are motivated to work out agreeable terms to licenses. Otherwise, they're not going to generate any revenue. So they do have to be flexible. They understand that these things are negotiable. But some universities are easier to work with than others. Some are very hardcore and they take the position, take it or leave it. Others are definitely more willing to make it a give and take. But again, just like anything else, it's a negotiation. So everything is on the table for negotiation. The terms, the royalties, the cash payments, the milestones, equity. So a lot of companies, when they're just starting out, they may not be actually ready to write a check and pay cash to the university. So there are option agreements, which are very low cost ways of having the first dibs on technology. So I think, the key here is to work with an attorney that has done a lot of transactions, has familiarity with a lot of the parameters that can be negotiated, and also preferably someone who has worked with that university, has a good feeling for the people, the personalities, the culture, that kind of thing. And a lot of the big firms that do many transactions, they actually keep databases, which is very helpful because then you have the terms of the licenses, and it kind of sets a precedent for kind of what the ranges are for royalties and cash payments and things like that. And those are always very helpful.
Good. And following up on something you mentioned, you could think about doing an option agreement, and you tied that to funding. But are there other reasons or strategies for why someone would do an option versus a license?
The main reason that I see people taking an option is just they don't have the money up front, but they want to preserve the right or access to that IP. And so it's really all tied in with fundraising. So right before the first, let's say a seed round or a Series A closes, the startup company will exercise that option, secure the rights to the IP, and then the transaction can go through. Because obviously, the investor is not going to give a company money if they don't have access to the technology.
Great, thanks, Doug P. And Doug L., is there anything else you'd like to add about university IP and strategies for dealing with TTOs?
No, I think it covered it pretty well.
Great. So let's talk a little more broadly, about dealing with other third parties, for example, vendors. So a lot of companies working with, vendors on finalizing their product design, and also maybe potentially working with universities, again, going back to, some of the clinical data and things like that. So what are strategies for, dealing with these third parties and who gets what when it comes to ownership of IP? So Doug L., let's start with you.
There's no blanket rule of who gets the IP or how you want to set it up. Everything's up for negotiation, but you definitely want to talk about it and put it down in writing, preferably in a license agreement up front, so everyone understands before things go too far who's going to own the IP. And a typical way of there's a joint development between two parties of owning the IP is if party A and party B are working together, anything that party A already has or develops during the process themselves, they own. Anything that party B develops, they own, and anything that's created during their joint development is owned jointly. With universities, it's typically the university wants to retain ownership. But you can negotiate with universities to, in some cases, you not only want an exclusive license, but you want to own the IP. That can be expensive, but that's always something that can be negotiated. And then with vendors, it's typically the opposite. The startup company typically is in the power position and says, whatever the vendor develops will be owned by the startup company. So it's all comes down to how you want to negotiate ownership rights.
So, and as far as timing, it sounds like when you're thinking about working with these different parties, obviously university you can't, but with a vendor, it sounds like ironing out the terms or ahead of time is the best strategy. But is there an opportunity to do it later in the process, and what advice do you have for that? So Yuri, let's kick it over to you.
Yeah, so I think Doug's answer was really comprehensive, and I just would stress that it's important to have this in writing beforehand. I really think if this isn't actually settled before the IP is developed, it can be a problem later on down the road. It is possible to sort things out down the road, but it can get expensive and complicated. Again, thinking sort of about how investors and acquirers diligence a portfolio, these types of agreements, these types of relationships are definitely things that sophisticated investors and acquirers look at, and they definitely raise red flags, and they can be big problems. Yeah. So definitely beforehand, that's what I stress.
Can I just add one thing to that, Kathryn?
Of course.
Yeah, so you can have these non-disclosure agreements, you can have these joint development agreements in place, and you should, and those are all great. But if there's ever a bad actor or ever a dispute, the only way you're gonna be able to, get any resolution to the problem is you're gonna have to probably drag the other party to court, and that's gonna be a tremendous distraction for the company, take a huge amount of resources, time, money, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of taking the belt and suspenders approach is, having those agreements in place, but also, as soon as you can, filing patent applications on your inventions. That way you've kind of got two stakes in the ground. You've got the non-disclosure or the JDA in place, and as well as a filing date on a patent application, and that can help you.
That's great. Thank you, Doug, or thank you all of you for answering that question. So this is another one that comes from one of our companies. They're curious about licensing, royalty structure, and working with another corporation. So in this particular case, they have a commercial partner that's actively interested in a non-exclusive license for their territory. Are there things that the company could do as a licensor that would be advantageous for them? So Doug, Al, let's go to you.
Things they can do would be advantageous. I'm not sure I'm understanding what they're trying to get at with the question, but there are many ways to structure it with another corporation. It doesn't have to be royalty payments. It could be structured an upfront payment, and then a milestone payment as milestones are met. And you can negotiate it in a number of different ways, dividing it up. The question was about a non-exclusive license. So you can license some rights for some products in certain territories for certain time limits. You can slice it up a number of different ways. And generally, you're looking for a win-win situation that is going to make a long-term relationship with the licensee that works in their best interest and yours as well. And oftentimes, it's not a one and done. You make a license agreement and then it lasts for 5 or 10 years. Oftentimes, circumstances change, and in a year or two, you might go back and renegotiate some of those terms. So it can be a very fluid process.
That's great. And Doug P., do you have anything to add to that?
So again, I'm not exactly sure what the company is asking, but if they're concerned about, sort of preserving their rights, if the licensee is not actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, then, maybe a best efforts clause in that license is a good idea, meaning the licensee has to exert, reasonable commercial effort to actually practice that invention. And if they don't, then the rights would go back to the licensor. So that's a common clause that we see, and that would help preserve some rights.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful with dealing with the potential of people buying the or licensing the IP and putting it on the shelf. So that's great advice, Doug P. So let's move on to talking a little bit about preparing for due diligence. So, IP strategy as it relates to valuations and investment or acquisition potential, something that we had started this webinar talking about. So how important is IP in the minds of an investor or an acquirer? And is it different when you're talking about a digital health solution versus a hardware or a device? So Yuri, let's start with you.
So it's interesting, because all the panelists here today, we're all intellectual property attorneys, so that's our focus. What I've learned is I think that investors value intellectual property, and it certainly is important. But it depends on the space in terms of how much of a focus it is, and I think that's what the question's getting at. In the pharmaceutical space, certainly intellectual property is critical, and in other spaces, it can matter more or less. I think if you're a product that's a disruptive type of innovation in the medical device space, I think intellectual property is going to be very important because you're going to be the first to enter the market and you want to keep competitors out. So to answer that question, it really depends on the product in terms of how I think investors see the IP. In terms of what you want to present to investors in any situation as an IP attorney, I think you want to have a very good story in terms of what your strategy was for developing the portfolio. You want to assure the investors that the claims that you have either pending or hopefully that are issued cover your product and cover your product pipeline as well. And if there are any issues with the portfolio, you want to be very upfront about that. And you want to address it. You want to have explanations for why you have had trouble, for example, in terms of getting something allowed, or if there's an inventor who has not yet signed an assignment, you want to point that out. You want to explain what's going on, how it's being addressed, and so forth.
Great. And Doug P., in your experience, what when working with investors or acquirers, what have you seen that they're looking for in a portfolio? And do they care if something is patent or that the patent has been issued, or are provisionals okay? What has been your experience with that?
As far as whether the patent has issued or not, it kind of depends on where you are in terms of your product development cycle and where your company is. If you're just starting out, I don't think any investor would, reasonably expect to have you necessarily have issued patents. They understand that it's a process and it takes time. But that being said, I think you need to have a story. You need to be able to explain to the investors, what your invention is and why it's distinguished from the prior art, and be able to show, what the closest prior art is, and convince the investors that yes, there is something patentable there. And then as far as, what investors would expect your patents to cover, any of the critical features. Imagine you're going up an elevator doing your 30-second pitch to an investor, and you're going to say, hey, our invention is great because it does this and this and this and this. Those are the features that hopefully you have protected or you're pursuing protection for in a patent application. And so when you do get patents issued, you issued claims to nicely to the actual commercial product features. That's probably the most critical. Another aspect would be to try to get claims that cover competitor products that may design around your primary features. So that way you have the offensive and the defensive claims.
That's great. And Doug L., anything you'd like to add to that?
Not so much add to it, but just echo what Doug P. just said, because I think it's really important. It's not enough to just get patents on your product. You may have patents that you get issued that cover your product, but it's really, you got to be strategic about what patents you're getting. Are they covering broadly the most commercially relevant features that are going to make you successful in the marketplace? That's what you really want to make sure you're getting good patent protection on. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 or more patents to approach that feature from different angles. You get different types of claims, method claims, device claims, system and subsystem claims. Make sure you really have the most important features nailed down, because that's what an investor is going to look at when they talk to you and figure out what's really most important about your product. They want to make sure you've got strong patent protection on those features and not some other less important features on your product.
And, you know, something someone had brought up earlier was FTO or freedom to operate. You know, so maybe you could talk a little bit about where that fits in the timeline for a startup, you know, how much they should be investing in this early and how important is it, you know, especially when they're approaching an investor or an acquirer, you know, how much of their resources should they put into it? Because, you know, is there a likelihood that the investor or acquirer will do it themselves? So Doug, we could continue with you.
Yeah, as I alluded to earlier on, it is a chicken and egg problem. You want to start off with small steps and you take passes at it. You do a quick FTO, freedom to operate search early on. It may be as simple as the inventor or the founders doing a Google search or looking on PatentSnap or other USPTO's website and just seeing what patents they can find out there. And then with each level of innovation and a round of funding, you take a deeper and deeper dive into it. After a year or two, maybe you're commissioning some outside searches, you know, maybe spending $5,000 or $10,000, taking a deeper dive into what prior art is out there. And then eventually, you know, if you 2 or 3 years down the road, you might find a problematic patent and you might need to write a written opinion on that to make investors comfortable and to shore up your position that you're not willfully infringing someone else's patent. And a typical written opinion costs $20,000 to $30,000, sometimes more. It's not something you want to spend a lot of money on up front, playing defense, writing all kinds of written memos of how you don't infringe. But being forewarned is forearmed. You just want to, economically as possible, do as much prior art searching as you can, and at least have an oral explanation of why each patent that you've uncovered is not going to be a problem.
And Yuri, have you seen anything, you know, or do you have anything to add to that similar thinking as far as when to do an FTO?
Yeah, so exactly like Doug said, I think, and I would present it this way. So what a freedom to operate analysis typically amounts to is you're going to identify the risk of litigation against your company. And a good freedom to operate analysis will also provide you with ways to mitigate that risk, either by digging into those identified patents that could be a problem and maybe finding issues with those patents, or thinking about ways to work around those claims. And it's an expensive process. It requires a lot of searching, a lot of analysis, and a lot of thought. And it has probably its highest value to the company at a point where the company would really be at risk to having someone actually assert a patent against them. And typically that's when the company's has a product on the market that's commercial, that people see, and that they're gaining some traction commercially. It's not typically very, very early on when you have a couple inventors who come together and form a company. So it is something that you can kind of sort of survey over time as you do your IP work and you see what competitors are doing. But to get the formal FTO, you're going to get your most bang for your buck when there actually is a threat of some litigation.
Okay, good. And let's move into some specific questions submitted by our company. So recently, one of our companies had completed an audit. They used an independent evaluation firm that specializes in these type of analysis. And so, Doug P., in your experience, are these valuation audits frequently used and to determine IP valuation?
Yeah, I mean, I've been the subject of some of these IP audits, and sometimes you get some very good feedback from the other firm that results in the portfolio being strengthened. So I'm certainly not opposed to doing those. It identifies strengths and weaknesses. I think the downside is they can be very costly because it is a form of IP diligence. So that it takes time. Levels in the detail, so there's a lot of detail work, and again, that takes attorney time, which is expensive. So not a bad thing if budget permitting. I think it's good. Investors definitely will take a look at that and factor that into their business decisions. But I think I would have to say, and this may be a little bit cynical, I'd like to hear what some of my co-panelists have to say, but I personally think that IP rarely ever stops a deal from happening. I think if the business guys want the deal to go through, they will, regardless of what the IP situation is, unless it's an absolute mess. But where it affects the deal is in terms of valuation. So if there are problems, then the valuation will go down. So I don't know how much value an IP audit actually has, but you're going to definitely go through some kind of IP diligence during most fundraising activities. And if it's a friends and family round or sort of an angels round, it might be a little more casual, a little less in depth. But if you start taking professional money from venture capitalists or other more sophisticated investors, they will do a fairly deep dive. They'll oftentimes hire their own counsel to review things and perform these IP audits. So it's a good idea to be ready for them and be ready to have a good IP story and make sure all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted.
So Doug L., any other thoughts about that and what Doug P. had brought up about IP as far as valuation and business deals?
Yeah, I think Doug P. covered it very well. I agree with everything he said. I would add that it's my opinion too that the independent evaluation, I think those are not as common, maybe not always worth the money that's invested in them. And the reason being that each investor typically has their own counsel that they're comfortable with, they have a relationship with, they trust, and they're going to want them to come in and take a look at the IP and weigh in on it. And so they may not be persuaded by this very expensive outside independent evaluation you've had done. And I also agree that you want to go into it, having done as much as possible and not having the due diligence counsel on the other side come up with a patent and say, what about this? Have you thought about that? And never having seen it before. Oftentimes, if that's brought up and you're caught flat-footed, if there's any problems that the other side sees, even if you're able to resolve that problem, it usually means they're looking at a lot of other things and taking a deeper dive into it because they're not comfortable with your initial response on something. But if you can go in and you've done your homework and as soon as opposing counsel says, what about this patent? You say, yeah, we're aware of that. It's not a problem because of A, B, and C, and quickly check the boxes. The due diligence tends to go much more quickly and cost a lot less for the startup if you can come in really well prepared.
Great, and Yuri, I'll just kick it over to you since this is such a important topic. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Nothing to add from the audit perspective. Yeah, I would just echo everything that's been said about IP diligence, and it's just as Doug Al just said, it's just so important to be prepared, to have answers ready. Yeah, just really good preparation, communication with the client. Very important.
Good, and then the last thing I wanted to address was a question about CDAs and NDAs. So when is the best time, or when should a company have one, especially as far as talks with strategics or even investors? When should they be signing these, and are there any pitfalls they should be aware of when getting into one of these agreements. So Yuri, we'll continue with you.
Yeah, so what I can say about NDAs is you'll find that a lot of investors won't actually sign these. And so, especially VCs, because they're seeing a lot of technologies in the same field, they likely will not sign these. So the way that I think about these is it is very important to be careful when entering in discussions with people that you want to invest in your company or that you want to collaborate with, to be mindful of what you are sharing with them when you are not able to put an NDA in place. And as Doug Portnow mentioned before, it is really critical, I think also, even when you do have an NDA in place, if you are going to have discussions with an outside party, to get something on file before that discussion. Again, even with the NDA in place, that confidentiality that the NDA offers can give you certain protections, but in terms of getting the absolute best protection that will allow you to safely or as safely as you can share confidential information, you want to have a patent application on file that covers everything that you would want to share.
Yep. And Doug P., is there anything you wanted to add about that?
No, I think Yuri covered it all.
Good. So then let's move on to the last topic of the webinar, which is about, resources and cost. And, obviously we're talking about startups here, and a lot of them are working on a limited budget. So, we want to maximize the value they're getting with their budget. And as part of that would be IP counsel. So, what are some thoughts about who to retain and how to deal with IP counsel? How proactive should you expect your IP counsel to be? So Doug P., we'll start with you.
Well, I think you definitely want to retain IP counsel that is very familiar with your technology and your industry or space. I think that's critical as far as drafting patent applications and prosecuting them before the USPTO and getting claims that are meaningful. Also remember, there are some overlap between patent law and FDA regulatory rules, so you want somebody who kind of understands those aspects and the nuances of medical device technology. So, when you're interviewing attorneys, you got to ask them, like, are you familiar with all of this stuff? And then, yes, the rates are very critical. You have, I think the average hourly rate for a medical device patent attorney, don't quote me on this, but it's probably somewhere between $500 and $650 an hour, something like that. And other firms go way beyond that, and some of the smaller firms can be lower. Be careful, because sometimes you get what you pay for. Obviously, you want to make sure you have competent counsel. So those would be kind of my initial thoughts on that.
And Yuri, for you as well, when you're dealing with potential clients, what are some of the things that you advise them as far as, as their IP counsel?
So talking with respect to cost or just in general?
With cost.
Yeah, so again, just echoing a lot of what Doug just said. So there is a range of what you could pay. I think what you want to make sure is that if you are paying more, that you're getting the value, and what that value is to me is someone who will, as Doug said, understand your technology thoroughly, and be able to identify with respect to the market what features really make your innovation valuable. And that's the first part of it. And the second part of it, which is even more important, once you've made that analysis, to then develop that into a fully formed strategy. What I've tended to see, and this is just anecdotal, I don't mean to badmouth any particular patent practitioners, but I think patent practitioners who practice at the lower end of the cost scale tend to take more of a snapshot of what you present them, and that's what they'll file. They'll file exactly what you tell them, because that's kind of the quick and efficient way to get something on file, but they're not doing that analysis step, and they're not doing that comprehensive intellectual property strategy development step. So if clients approach me for the first time, I'm going to tell them what I think is really, really cool about their invention from my perspective. And I'm going to tell them, here's how I think you guys need to develop a portfolio. Here's what I think your 1-year IP strategy is. Here's what I think your 5-year IP strategy is. 10-year IP strategy is.
Great. And Doug, Al, working with your clients, what are some thoughts or strategies that you have about managing their IP costs as far as, the actual patent costs and then the maintenance fees that come up? How does that relate to their fundraising timelines?
I think with my clients, it's when I start working with a new client, I think it's all about good communications, just making sure we're talking all the time, make sure that they're feeling like they're getting enough attention and being proactive and doing enough work on the one hand, but not causing heartburn at the end of each month with the legal bills. So striking that right balance, it's different for each company. And so you just need to be communicating early and often. So there are no surprises in the legal bills that if a client doesn't want to spend a certain amount of money for a project, make sure before the time is spent that there's an understanding that what things cost and how much of their budget they want to spend. As far as timing with investors, each round, often there's a flurry of activity before each round is closed. And so that can get expensive right at a time when funding is uncertain. So I think just constant communication there again is really important. And sometimes the law firm will need to defer fees for a number of months till the funding closes, because you do want to be prepared for the due diligence and make sure the funding does come through. So those are my thoughts on how that relates to funding.
Sure, that's great. Thank you, Doug, Al. And so the last thing, in addition to counsel, there's a lot of other resources out there that are available to startups. What are your thoughts on things such as something you had mentioned earlier was PatSnap, or another one, Innography. How much value can be found in these platforms, and are there any that you suggest that our startups use?
Is that?
Yeah, Doug, we'll continue with you.
Everyone's got their personal preference on patent searching databases. Law firms tend to use expensive paid databases that have a lot more bells and whistles and more reliable content. But there's a lot of free good ones out there like PatSnap and Free Patents Online, and the USPTO itself has obviously a very sound database. It can be a little cumbersome to use sometimes. But I think to the extent a company has founders or engineers that can make the time to spend looking through these databases and searching for prior art, it really makes sense to do, as we talked about earlier. But it is time consuming, and oftentimes it's best just to talk with your patent counsel once you've established that relationship. Kind of figure out a working relationship that works to keep the right balance. You don't want your patent attorney doing all the searching because it's going to spend a lot of your money. But I think it's helpful to have the company doing some of their own searching to cover a lot of ground, and then the patent attorney doing some searching as well to make sure you're not missing something important.
Yuri, any other resources to add to the list? or thoughts on those resources?
It's funny. So my personality, like around the houses, I'm a very DIY type of person, but I just, I tend to not advise people to do too much DIY on the intellectual property front. I think, you know, with respect to definitely working with your attorney to draft a patent application, 100%, you know, all of the companies and inventors' efforts are welcome. But yeah, in terms of searching through databases and prior art searches, it can be tricky. You need a certain amount of knowledge to know what you're looking at and how important it is and how it relates or doesn't relate. So I tend not to encourage too much of that.
And Doug P, we'll finish off with you with this question. You know, what are your thoughts on these resources?
Yeah, I kind of take a middle ground here where just for cost reasons, a lot of my clients, you know, they don't want their attorney spending tons and tons of money searching and then reviewing patents. So what I usually tell our clients is, hey, you guys take a first stab at this, go identify, you know, the most relevant references and then flag, you know, the most important ones. And then we as attorneys can take a look at those and tell you if there are issues or not. And that usually works. You know, most of my clients are pretty savvy and very intelligent, and they can do a lot of the searching on their own. And I think it does save some time and money. So that's kind of my compromise position.
That's great. So we'll end the webinar there. You know, I want to thank you guys, Doug L, Yuri, Doug P, for joining us on this webinar. I'm going to switch off offline and invite some of our companies to stick around and ask you some questions.